president and co-owner of Richmond Brothers, Matt Curfman.
Hi, Bart.
Hi, Matt. Good to see you.
Good to see you too. Thanks for having me.
Great to have you back. And we've survived the first quarter of 2022, but not without some bumps and some worry. We've seen the Fed raise interest rates. We've seen some scary headlines.
Yeah.
Where do things? What's your perspective on the end of the first quarter?
Well, it was the first quarter really in a couple of years where we've had negative benchmark performances, and benchmarks would be the Dow Jones, the S&P 500, the NASDAQ. Even the broad bond benchmarks were negative. And so you mentioned interest rates. March of 2022, I have to remember which year we're in, the Federal Reserve did start their first short-term interest rate increase. And so we're not used to that. And so I do, you've probably seen them before, some Matt's Minutes videos we send out to our clients on YouTube. And being a Michigander, and we joked about how we really want spring today, but there was snow this morning. So an analogy I use when I talk to our clients and our team with interest rates is it's just been such a long time since the Federal Reserve has raised the short-term interest rate. And so if we're in Michigan, it seems like every winter comes and goes, and we get to winter in November and December each year, and we get our first snow or ice storm, and we all go out driving, and we're all, just for that first day or two, a little crazy on the road. Mm-hmm. And then we remember, we've lived here our whole life. We know what it's like to drive on snow and ice, and then it's kind of like riding a bicycle. But it's just been so long since interest rates have really gone up. And you just talked about a couple of investment and real estate properties. So as an example, the lower that short-term rate is, the lower mortgage rates are, the lower borrowing rates are. So that tends to stimulate the economy. So the Federal Reserve thinks they're going to keep raising the rate, and that's caused a lot of volatility in the markets. Historically speaking, what people will remember eventually is that when the Federal Reserve is raising the short-term rate, they're doing it to help combat inflation, which we're all experiencing, higher cost of fuel, higher cost of food are some big name items that we feel in our month-to-month budgets. And two, they're raising rates because the actual underlying economic conditions are improving. That doesn't mean everything is perfect, and that doesn't mean every sector is perfect. But those are really the main reasons that the Federal Reserve looks to raise those rates.
So using the reason of trying to control inflation, how does raising interest rates, which would affect someone borrowing money for a house, car, how does that stem in the growth of inflation?
So it's probably more complex than we need to get into for today's discussion. But in general, the higher those short-term interest rates are, it affects borrowing, and then it kind of trickles back out economically to different pockets. And so that's one of the ways that the Federal Reserve can do that. With respect to the markets and stocks and long-term investments, if you needed your money in kind of the short term, like if people say, hey, I'm still not getting much on my bank account or my savings or my credit union account, can I go invest it? Well, it's hard to do that in a rising interest rate environment when there's a lot of geopolitical uncertainty with Russia and Ukraine. And your last guest was on because we're just still trying to make our way out of a 2-year pandemic. Mm-hmm. We're not out of the woods yet. So there's still a lot of that wall of worry out there. Some data I pulled on the interest rate question with the Federal Reserve. If you go back historically, there is not a single exception to this. Whenever the Federal Reserve has begun a raising interest rate cycle, a year later, equity markets have been stronger and higher than they were than when they started. There's not a single exception to that in history. Mm-hmm. So it doesn't guarantee that's the outcome we'll get this time, but that at least gives me some context and gives investors some context as well. And also historically, we just talked about inflation. Any time in history, again, where you go into a higher inflationary period, one of the best asset classes to own in your investment portfolio is equities. So those would be stocks, which would be some of the benchmarks. So while it's choppy right now, I would just kind of have that historical context as you think about, when do I need this money? What am I investing for? Kind of always fall back to what your plan is and what are you investing for? What's your time horizon, and is that appropriate for what you're trying to accomplish?
All these stories we're hearing about inflation, they all talk about, well, we have not had any increase in inflation or an increase like this in 20, 30 years.
Yeah.
Is this just, have we had it too good for so long that we're just now, it's payback time?
So that's a great question, and I think certainly there's always the possibility that it's just been too good to be true for too long. And you're right, it probably goes back to late 70s and into the 80s, where we really had, if you talk to anyone who had a mortgage back then, since we were talking about interest rates, people who had mortgages or land contracts were thrilled with a 10, 12, 14% mortgage rate back then. People nowadays think a 4 or 5% is totally crazy, because we're used to too good to be true, 2.5%, 3.5% rates, which has allowed people to perhaps afford bigger houses, bigger properties, because lower rates, lower payments. So there's also this pandemic piece that probably falls into the middle of that. A lot of issues globally with supply chain. And so that's led to inflation in some different pockets as well. So as the world, we try to find our way through the pandemic to whatever our new normal is, it's possible that some of those things that were not really business cycle with inflation, it had more to do with the pandemic, which was, I suppose we can call it a once in 100-year event, black swan. That as that settles down, we could have some opportunity to see some of these inflation figures settle down as well. But we'll have to wait and see what the future holds there.
Yeah, talk about once in 100 years, maybe once in never, that we've had a situation where people couldn't find employees. We started the pandemic, we were all concerned everybody's going to lose their jobs. But, obviously some people did, but at the point now we're in, there are so many jobs just going begging. That's never been
more jobs than people. And you'll probably know this better than me, but I see, I think it's a weekly or monthly email that comes out in Jackson, and they talk about all the job postings that haven't been able to be filled. It's through one of our local resources, and there's 14, 15, 1,600 jobs, and these are well-paying jobs also. So it's even right here in Jackson, we're seeing that. So that is certainly a challenge and a unique circumstance that's not normal historically.
Yeah, I stopped by Meijer this morning. They're looking for people at $12.25 an hour, and I thought, you're out of luck. There's places across the street that are paying $15, $16 an hour.
Yeah,
it's such a competitive job market.
Yeah,
the increase in the wages, is that contributing to inflation? Are we getting it both ways? Like people want to be able to pay more and to earn more, but you're going to have to pay more for the hamburger too, right?
Yeah, I mean, it kind of goes full cycle. And so when you deal with inflation and you think about incomes, because really most people feel the impact of inflation when the income that they have doesn't spend as far as it used to, like fuel prices go up, food prices go up. So the way to deal with it is you either cut your expenses on the same income, or you have to go find a higher wage to keep up with inflation. So you get pressure on both sides there.
Well, like the snow of this morning and Michigan weather in general, if you don't like it, wait a minute. Does that apply to everything we're talking about today?
I think there's some truth to that, because there's a lot of shock and awe kind of right now. And we're in circumstances that we're just not used to from a historical perspective. And so sometimes it's easy to forget when it was only a year or two ago. And even your last guest, you guys joked that it's been 2 short years, but it's probably been 2 long years of the pandemic. Sometimes we lose track of time in this 2 years of how the world was so different than anything that any of us have been used to. But I think from a financial planning perspective and an investing perspective, always just take a step back, take a deep breath, try to use data to make decisions rather than emotion. But money is emotional, so you can't discount the fact that sometimes we do make financial decisions emotionally. And so just make sure you're working with a qualified professional. And we say the same with your taxes, with your estate plan, whether it's accountants, financial planners, attorneys, just all of those professional areas of expertise that they really do all impact each other. And if I'm outside of that world and I'm going out and getting my taxes done or an estate plan or I hire a financial advisor, as an individual, I probably know the least, not me personally, but in this example, and yet I'm here to quarterback all of these professionals. So it's really important to bring all of those areas of expertise together to help you make the best decision for you.
Especially now when we've got so many things changing, unprecedented, and laws and tax situations, government, COVID assistance. There's a lot of things that people need help navigating with.
Absolutely, and in fact, just recently, the Secure Act was passed in December of 2019, and that had to do with what happens when you inherit retirement accounts from someone else, an IRA, a Roth, a 401k. And 2.5 years in, the government just released updated guidance on how to interpret that law from more than 2 years ago. And a lot of the country was interpreting it incorrectly because it wasn't maybe written very well to begin with. So it's constantly changing, and you want to make sure that you're working with someone to help you bring all that together.
We've got an event coming up. Richmond Brothers is hosting a
shredded event right after tax season. And did you have the date in front of you by chance?
I do. April 29, Friday.
April 29th, Friday, I think from 11 to 1 out at Richmond Brothers Hangar, which is at the Jackson Airport. Kind of post-tax season, post-April 15th is the tax filing deadline, or really Monday the 18th, I suppose. But bring all your documents out, shred them, you see them securely put into that bin. And then we're also doing it as a fundraiser to help some nonprofits from a humanitarian standpoint with efforts in Ukraine.
Nice. Well, we're all looking, I think, for ways we can help, and we appreciate this opportunity.
Absolutely. Thank you for having me, Bart. Appreciate it.
You bet. And we'll remind you as we get closer to April 29th about the free shredding event. And I think Matt will even buy you lunch. So just stay with us here on JTV. Thanks.
Thanks, Bart.
Matt Curfman, Certified Financial Planner, co-owner and president at Richmond Brothers. Up next,